Rain hammered the marble steps of Sterling Industries as whispers hardened into laughter. Rosalind Carter, once a rising architect, now in a wheelchair, clutched her sketch tube like a shield while executives filmed her. Serena, the CEO in a red dress, smiled. "Pity auditions are downstairs." A small voice cut the room. "Mom!" An 8-year-old sprinted through the crowd and wrapped Rosalind's leg. Everyone turned to the janitor behind him, Elias Dalton, frozen, terrified. For a heartbeat, humiliation became possibility, and every secret in the building tilted toward truth. 18 months earlier, Rosalind Carter had been the kind of woman people pointed to as proof that hard work rewarded itself. Born to a single mother who cleaned offices at night, Rosalind had clawed her way through a competitive architecture program on full scholarship. By 30, she was Sterling Industries' rising star, the designer behind the Harbor Commons renovation that had made national trade journals. She sketched bold lines and believed in buildings that spoke for their inhabitants. Her colleagues admired her. Clients trusted her instincts. Even Serena Whitmore, the new CEO, had offered her a senior position in the firm's planning division. Then came the accident. Her ex-fiancé, intoxicated and furious after a breakup, had rammed his car into hers at a red light. 3 surgeries. 18 weeks in rehabilitation. The spinal injury was permanent. Her legs, the doctors explained with surgical precision, would no longer carry her weight. Rosalind had stared at the words on the paper "complete paralysis below 10" and felt the ground beneath her identity disappear. The fiancé faced drunk driving charges. What she faced was different. When she returned to work in a wheelchair, the energy shifted. Colleagues who once sought her opinion now spoke around her, as though disability had made her somehow unreliable. One colleague suggested, with embarrassing gentleness, that she might be happier in a different role. A client asked if she could still really manage a complex project from a wheelchair. Her confidence, already fractured, developed deeper cracks. Rosalind refused to break completely. She had survived worse. She had watched her mother work 3 jobs to keep them afloat. She had learned early that resilience was not a choice, but a requirement. Within 2 months, she had adapted her desk, recalibrated her drafting tools, and thrown herself into a new project, one nobody else wanted. The city had decades-old parkland on the harbor waterfront, meant to serve families and children, but the terrain was treacherous. Steep pathways, inaccessible playgrounds, broken equipment. Rosalind saw opportunity where others saw liability. She envisioned Sterling Harbor Rehab Park, a therapeutic and fully accessible playground designed with children facing physical and developmental challenges in mind. Ramps that curved smoothly, play structures engineered for low upper body strength, sensory zones for children on the autism spectrum. Her mother's voice echoed in her mind. "If you're going to do something, do it for people who have no one else." Elias Dalton had not planned to become a janitor. He had spent 9 years as a mechanical engineer in Sterling Industries' manufacturing division. The kind of man who solved problems by understanding how systems worked, how forces distributed, how friction could be minimized, how small changes could prevent catastrophic failures. He was good at what he did. He had earned respect and a stable salary that allowed him to raise his son alone after Leo's mother had decided motherhood was not for her. 3 years ago, Elias had discovered something in the maintenance logs. The original ramp system at one of the factory sites had been marked for replacement due to safety concerns. The budget request had been rejected. Then it appeared again. Rejected again. When a worker fell and broke his ankle, Elias had traced the incident back to the ramp. He had reported it. He had filled out forms and sent emails and documented everything with the meticulous precision of an engineer who understood that details saved lives. What he had not anticipated was that Clinton Reeves, the CFO, had been the one rejecting those safety upgrades. that Serena Whitmore, the new CEO, had signed off on the decision to minimize spending regardless of structural risk, that reporting it would be treated not as conscientious oversight but as insubordination. "We're reorganizing the engineering structure," his manager had explained, not meeting his eyes. "You'd be a better fit in facilities." Facilities meant janitorial work. It meant half his salary. It meant his son asked why he came home smelling like industrial cleaner. But it also meant benefits were preserved, and Leo's school fund remained untouched. Elias had accepted the demotion with the particular dignity of a man who understood that fighting would hurt his son. He cleaned hallways and maintained equipment and watched Sterling Industries operate as though the rules that applied to everyone else did not apply to people like Clinton Reeves. Leo Dalton, at 8 years old, possessed the observational gifts of children who had grown up with one parent working constantly. He noticed small things. His father's hands, which had once been smooth, now bore small cuts from cleaning tools. The way his father's expression shifted when they passed Sterling Industries on their way home. A subtle hardening, a tightening around the eyes, and he noticed when his father seemed lighter, when his shoulders dropped and his voice warmed. This happened most often in the park near their apartment, where Rosalind had begun working in the evenings, measuring and sketching. It was Leo who approached her first. He had been drawing with sidewalk chalk, something with wheels and ramps, though the perspective was impossible and the proportions wrong. Rosalind had wheeled over and asked what he was building. "A park where my dad doesn't have to be sad," he had said with the devastating honesty of children who see directly into the hearts of the adults who raise them. She had laughed a real laugh, the kind she had not permitted herself in months. They had talked about accessibility and slope angles and why some children needed special designs. Leo had been fascinated. He began meeting her in the park twice a week, and Rosalind began teaching him about architecture the way her mother had taught her about resilience. Not as abstract theory, but as a series of choices that either included people or left them behind. Elias had discovered the connection when Leo came home excited about Miss Rosalind and her project. When he had come to collect his son one evening and found them together, Rosalind wheeling her chair around a model park while Leo held the sketches, he had felt something shift in his chest. He recognized himself in her, the specific kind of strength that came from refusing to diminish yourself even when the world voted for you to disappear. Serena Whitmore had been educated at elite universities and trained in the specific discipline of maximizing shareholder value. She was brilliant and ruthless and wore power like other women wore perfume. She had taken over Sterling Industries, promising to modernize operations, and what she meant was to cut everything that did not directly generate profit. She had looked at the harbor waterfront and seen not a therapeutic resource for vulnerable children, but premium real estate. Harbor towers. Mixed use development with luxury apartments. Retail space. Market rate hotel. The profit margins were astonishing. The only obstacle was an architect with a wheelchair and a dream about accessibility. She had assigned Amanda Hill to manage the situation. Amanda was exceptionally talented at the specific work of making unpopular decisions seem palatable. She had sent Rosalind emails, marked pending review, which meant the project existed in bureaucratic suspension. She had praised Rosalind's vision while creating conditions for it to suffocate. And when gentle obstruction seemed insufficient, Serena had made a decision. They would position Rosalind as the problem and position themselves as progressive. The autumn gala was designed precisely. Sterling Industries was hosting an evening for major donors and city officials, and Vivian Brooks, a community advocate who served on the Harbor Development Committee, had enthusiastically recommended that Rosalind present her park concept. It was positioned as an opportunity. What it actually was, though neither Rosalind nor Vivian realized it yet, was a stage. Rosalind had prepared meticulously. She had refined her presentation, rehearsed her talking points, made adjustments to her mock-up. She believed in the work. She believed that if she presented clearly, and professionally, the merit of the project would speak for itself. She had not yet learned that merit was not the variable being measured. The morning of the gala, Elias arrived early to ensure the new accessible ramp he had installed near the building entrance was functioning properly. He had worked on it after hours, using materials from Sterling's surplus inventory and his own time. The ramp was engineered to near-perfection smooth curve, proper slope, non-slip surface. Rosalind came to test it, and as she wheeled across his work, she felt the precision in his design. There were no rough spots, no hesitation points, no moments where the mechanism felt uncertain. This was the work of someone who understood not just mechanics but dignity. They had talked for 30 minutes, and Elias had mentioned casually that he had also designed some components for her park concept, a support system for the swings that would allow children with limited grip strength to participate safely. By evening, Rosalind was nervous but ready. She wheeled into the marble-floored atrium of Sterling Industries, where the gala was being held. Media had been invited. Cameras were positioned strategically. Amanda Hill was everywhere, smiling and directing coverage. Serena stood in a red dress that looked like power, already positioned near the stage. Rosalind began her presentation. She talked about inclusion and accessibility, and the specific ways physical design either welcomed or rejected vulnerable populations. She talked about children who had been told they were too fragile for normal playgrounds, and how dangerous that messaging could be. She showed the mock-ups, the curved ramps, the inclusive swings, the sensory gardens. She talked about Elias's engineering, about Leo's insight that courage was something that could be taught and reinforced through environment. For 7 minutes, she believed she was reaching them. Then Clinton Reeves had laughed. Not a malicious laugh exactly, but the laugh of a man who believed absurdity was self-evident. The cost analysis we've reviewed suggests this project is not financially viable for the city, he said. Specialized equipment, additional maintenance, complex design. The numbers are staggering. Serena had nodded sympathetically. Amanda had stepped forward with talking points about the city's budget constraints. And then someone in the audience, someone with a phone, had started recording. The whispers had begun immediately. Just something about the angle of the camera, the way it was filming Rosalind, rather than her presentation. The way one well-meaning journalist had asked, "How do you manage projects from a wheelchair?" The way the question itself implied impossibility. The way some people in the room had seemed almost disappointed that there was not more drama, more obvious struggle, more of the inspiration porn narratives that made able-bodied people feel good about themselves for not being cruel. By the time Rosalind had finished, she had felt the energy in the room. Not enthusiasm, pity. And underneath the pity, something worse. Skepticism. She had wheeled to a corner to compose herself, exhausted by the effort of trying to convince people that accessibility was not charity but necessity. She had not noticed Elias arrive. He had come to pick up Leo, who had been playing in a supervised area for children of employees. She had not heard the conversation building. She had not seen the moment when Leo, overtired and overstimulated, had asked his father, "Is that Miss Rosalind?" And then, without waiting for an answer, had run toward her. Everything after that existed in a strange clarity. The small body wrapping around her leg. The word "Mom" said with absolute certainty. The room going silent. Elias's face cycling through shock, fear, and something else, resignation, perhaps mixed with defiance. The realization that whatever calculations had been made about Rosalind and her project had just shifted entirely. Helen Grant, Sterling Industries' head of security, had been watching the whole evening with a particular attention. Helen was 63 and had spent her career in an environment that did not particularly value her opinion. But she noticed things: the way Clinton's face had shifted when Rosalind began speaking, the way Amanda had directed media attention, the specific quality of Serena's smile. Helen had also, over the past 3 months, noticed inconsistencies in maintenance logs, safety adjustments that had been ordered but never processed, notations marked on CFO directive. As Leo ran across the room, Helen had made a decision. Something about this moment seemed important. Something about watching a child claim a woman as mother in a room full of people who had been trying to diminish her seemed to require bearing witness. After security had gently managed the crowd, after Amanda had offered apologies that were not actually apologies, after everyone had pretended the moment was simply a confused child and a warm-hearted woman, Rosalind had wheeled to a quieter section of the building. Her heart had been racing. Leo had appeared, still holding her hand, and had presented her with a drawing, a family portrait of 3 figures, one in a wheelchair, one standing next to it, one small. At the bottom, in Leo's careful printing, were the words, "My family." Elias had come to retrieve his son. Mortified. "I'm so sorry," he had said repeatedly. "He sees you as his mother figure. He talks about you constantly. I never told him to." "It's okay," Rosalind had interrupted. And something in her voice had made Elias look at her directly. "Why does he call me that?" Leo had answered before Elias could formulate a response. "Because Mom is someone who makes you feel safe and tells you to keep going, even when you're scared. You do that." Rosalind had felt something in her chest reorganize. For months, she had been measuring her worth in terms of productivity and professional contribution. She had been asking whether her body could still perform its designated function. She had not considered that value might be measured in entirely different terms, that a child could call her mother not despite her disability, but perhaps because of the specific strength it had taught her. Helen Grant had witnessed this entire exchange. She had also, over the following days, made some decisions about what she would do with the information she had been quietly accumulating. Files on Clinton's email regarding the park project, safety logs documenting the rejected upgrades, maintenance records showing where his directives had overridden engineering recommendations. Over the next 2 weeks, Rosalind and Elias had begun working together in earnest. Elias had come to her apartment several evenings, and they had redesigned sections of the park together. He had shown her how to engineer the swings with reduced friction. She had shown him how to calculate slope angles for maximum accessibility with minimum visual obtrusiveness. Leo had fallen asleep on her couch, a small figure under a borrowed jacket, and neither of them had moved him. Elias had whispered, "I'm sorry about the situation at work. I know this position is..." "It's not your fault," Rosalind had said quietly. "And you know what? Your work is brilliant. A world that couldn't see that is the world's problem, not yours." He had looked at her for a long moment. "My wife, Leo's mother, left because she said I wasn't ambitious enough. That being a father was something to apologize for, rather than something to be proud of. Then she was wrong," Rosalind had said simply. Helen Grant had sent Rosalind an encrypted email with files attached, maintenance logs, email chains, documented safety violations stretching back years. At the bottom, Helen had written, "You should know what you're dealing with. And they should know you know." The revelation of the information had been shocking. Emails from Clinton to Serena explicitly discussing cost-cutting measures that violated safety protocols. Documentation of Elias's report being dismissed. The implication that Rosalind's project was being obstructed specifically to preserve Harbor Tower's feasibility. Rosalind had felt the weight of what this meant, not just for her project, but for the ethical structure of the organization itself. She had met with Elias and Vivian Brooks, and they had made a decision. They would go to the Harbor Development Committee with all of it. The evidence, the project, Leo's perspective, everything. It was a risk. The work could fail. Serena and Clinton could retaliate. Rosalind's career already fragile, could be destroyed entirely. But staying silent meant accepting that the people who had rejected safety to maximize profit would continue to do so. It meant allowing harbor towers to be built on top of a deliberate decision to ignore child welfare. It meant choosing security over integrity. And Rosalind had not survived everything to make that choice. Vivian Brooks had helped prepare Rosalind for the presentation to the committee. "They will attack you," Vivian had said bluntly. "They will suggest you're unstable. They will imply that your disability is making you irrational, or that you're seeking attention." "What if I'm not ready?" Rosalind had asked. "Then you'll still do it anyway," Vivian had replied. "Because the alternative is abandoning everything you believe in, and you're not that person." Elias had built a working model of one of the swings. He had used salvaged materials and demonstrated live how the engineering worked, how it distributed force in ways that allowed children with minimal grip strength to participate. He had done this work not because he was asked, but because it was the right work, and he was someone who understood the difference. Leo had asked if he could help. Rosalind and Elias had glanced at each other, and then they had let him. He had carried materials. He had watched the assembly. He had asked careful questions about why the angles mattered and how the pieces fit together. And at night, as they worked in Rosalind's apartment, something had shifted in all of them. The project had stopped being Rosalind's dream and had become something shared, something that belonged to all three of them in equal measure. The Harbor Development Committee meeting had been scheduled for a Thursday evening in late autumn. Rain had threatened all day, the sky hanging low and gray above Sterling Harbor. By the time the committee convened, the rain was falling steadily, as though the weather itself was demanding attention. Rosalind had begun her presentation not with data but with a story. She had talked about a little girl who, after a car accident, had believed her life was over because her body had changed. She had talked about how that girl had slowly learned that a changed body did not mean a diminished mind or heart or capacity to contribute. She had talked about children who faced similar transitions and deserved environments that told them they were still full members of the world. Then Elias had stepped forward with the model. He had demonstrated it live, showing how the mechanisms reduced friction and increased accessibility. Numbers had appeared on a screen behind him, actual cost analysis performed by his own calculations, showing that the specialized equipment was far less expensive than Serena and Clinton had suggested. Helen had stood and presented the maintenance logs, the email documentation, the explicit record of safety decisions being overridden for profit. Serena had attacked immediately. She had suggested that Rosalind was being manipulated by nostalgia and sentiment. She had implied that a woman in Rosalind's condition should not be trusted with major projects. She had positioned herself as the pragmatist, protecting the city from unrealistic idealism. But Vivian Brooks had stood then and presented community support documentation signatures from families with children facing disabilities, from therapists, from educators, from real people who understood that the park was not luxury but necessity. Leo had asked to speak. At 8 years old, he had walked to the front of the room and had looked directly at the committee members. He had said, "My dad was sad for a long time because he tried to tell people something bad was happening, and nobody listened. Miss Rosalind is sad because people think she can't do her job anymore just because she sits in a chair, but she's the smartest person I know. She helped me be brave. I think we all need people who help us be brave. I think the park should exist so other kids can be brave too." The room had gone quiet, and then had erupted. The committee members had questioned Serena and Clinton directly, asking them to explain the email correspondence, asking them to justify the cost claims that had been factually refuted, asking them why safety considerations had been rejected, and what criteria had been used to make those decisions. By the end of the meeting, the committee had voted unanimously to proceed with Sterling Harbor Rehab Park. They had also voted to initiate a formal investigation into Sterling Industries' practices under Clinton's financial oversight. The fallout had been immediate. Serena and Clinton had been placed on administrative leave, pending the investigation. Amanda Hill had deleted her social accounts and had sent a brief, hollow apology. Helen Grant had been offered the position of interim chief of operations, a role that properly valued her judgment. And Elias Dalton had been offered a position on the official project team as lead mechanical engineer. A title that restored not just his dignity, but his actual expertise to its proper place. Rosalind had been contracted by the city as lead designer for Sterling Harbor Rehab Park. It was not a position with Sterling Industries. It was her own firm, her own agency, her own authority. It was everything she had worked toward before the accident, made new and deeper by the knowledge that her body's changes had taught her something no able-bodied architect could have learned alone. The construction had taken 3 months. Early winter had given way to spring, and by mid-April, Sterling Harbor Rehab Park was ready for its inaugural opening. The ramps curved through the space like careful calligraphy. The play structures had been tested and retested. The sensory gardens bloomed with low-maintenance plants that responded to touch and smell. The entire space had been designed with the understanding that access was not an afterthought, but the foundational principle around which everything else had been built. Rosalind had wheeled through the finished park on opening day, and Elias had been beside her. Leo had run ahead, touching every surface, testing every swing. The weather had cleared after weeks of rain. April sunlight slanted across the new wood and metal in ways that made everything look provisional and hopeful, as though the world was being rebuilt right before their eyes. Children with various disabilities had come to play. Some used walkers. Some were deaf or autistic or had cognitive disabilities. Some were simply kids from the neighborhood who had been told they could not access the other playgrounds and who now discovered otherwise. Parents had cried. Journalists had taken pictures. Vivian Brooks had given a speech about community and accessibility and the specific kind of courage it took to build something that centered the people society usually forgot. Helen Grant had been there, standing near Elias, offering quiet acknowledgement. And then Elias had done something that surprised everyone, including himself. He had gotten down on one knee not despite the crowd or the official nature of the moment, but because of it. He had pulled a ring from his pocket, an understated band with a stone that caught the spring sunlight. "I have spent my whole life trying to fix things in the right way," he had said quietly enough that only Rosalind could hear, though people had stopped playing and stopped filming because something in his posture had communicated that something important was happening. "But I didn't know you could build something entirely new. Not fix what was broken, but create something that had never existed before. Something that said nobody gets left behind. Will you marry me? Will you let us, all 3 of us, build the next things together?" Rosalind had said yes before he could finish the sentence. They had been married 6 weeks later, in a small ceremony in the park itself. The ceremony had been held beneath one of the curved pavilions that Rosalind had designed, a structure that was beautiful to look at, but existed primarily to provide shade and shelter for people who needed it. The vows had been simple and specific, focused not on romantic language but on commitment, on choosing each other, on the particular bravery required to build a life with someone else after the world had tried to diminish you both. Leo had carried the rings. He had given them to his father with great solemnity, and then had asked Rosalind if this meant he could start calling her mom all the time now, and everyone had laughed a real laugh, the kind that felt like permission to be happy. 1 month after the wedding, a bronze plaque had been installed near the park's entrance. It read, "Sterling Harbor Rehab Park, designed by Rosalind Carter and Elias Dalton, for every child who chose courage." Below the inscription, 2 names were engraved, smaller: Leo Dalton and Vivian Brooks, because they had understood that the project belonged to all of them in equal measure. The park had become one of the most visited accessible playgrounds in the region. Families traveled from neighboring cities to use it. It had been featured in design journals and published in academic papers on universal accessibility. But more importantly, on any given afternoon, it was filled with children of all abilities, playing and laughing and learning the simple truth that they belonged in the world, that their bodies and their minds, and their specific ways of experiencing things were not obstacles to overcome, but variations that enriched everything they touched. Rosalind had eventually started her own firm. Elias had become a consultant on accessibility engineering. Leo had become, by all accounts, an unusually kind person who noticed when other people felt left out and did something about it. They had built more parks. They had designed community centers and schools and residential spaces built on the foundational principle that access was not luxury but human right. And on quiet evenings, they would wheel or walk through Sterling Harbor Rehab Park, the three of them, and Rosalind would remember the moment when a child's voice had cut through a room full of cruelty and had said "Mom" with such certainty that it had rewoven her entire understanding of what her life could be. She had learned that sometimes humiliation became possibility, that sometimes the things that tried to diminish you taught you instead how to build something bigger than anyone had imagined, that sometimes a janitor and an architect and a child, working together, could create something that changed the shape of the world.